This episode of TWA is brought to you by Campfire Blaze.
Do you want to make a fantasy world but are too lazy to build a detailed fantasy setting? Then urban fantasy is the genre for you! Wait, that sounds familiar. Oh right, I already did a video on urban fantasy back when I started the channel. That's okay, I've since read a lot more of the genre and I have so much more to complain about. I have so much more insight that I can offer. So join me in this second dive into urban fantasy reloaded. Last time I covered some of urban fantasy's usual suspects like werewolves, vampires, and plucky teens with mystical powers. But this time I would like to dig a little deeper into some other common aspects of urban fantasy, starting with, of course, the protagonist. When designing an urban fantasy protagonist, be sure to adhere to the 3 B's: black leather, blank slate, and bad attitude. Our protagonist always goes against the grain and would never wear a uniform, except for the standard urban fantasy female protagonist uniform of black leather. Does she always dress in black to mourn the death of her fashion sense? Well, mostly it's to match the book's cover art. Don't forget the tattoos to complete the punk look. If your protagonist happens to be a guy, then the cover artist will give him a hat no matter how much he never wears it in the story. On to the next B, blank slate. It's important to sand off any rough edges the character might have in order to make sure that the reader can insert themselves into the protagonist's shoes. I mean, they live in a world where magic is real. Could they at least have an opinion on that or some other kind of reaction other than angst? Can I at least give them a motive that explains why they decide to stick around in the dangerous edge between the modern and supernatural worlds? Why does the protagonist keep a job that requires facing down mythical monsters and it doesn't even pay a living wage? Because there must be nothing to get in the way of audience projection, and I'm sure it won't backfire by instead giving the audience nothing to latch onto. The final B in our list is bad attitude. It's important to remember that the protagonist conflates violence with strength of character, treats their colleagues with scorn, doesn't listen to people trying to help them, and only gets away with it because the plot supplies them with an endless series of safety nets to keep them out of trouble. Does the protagonist's bad attitude ever get them into trouble? Do they burn bridges with social connections that they really need to keep? Do any of these consequences fuel later conflict in the story? Of course not. The protagonist is the only one that can deal with the supernatural, as everyone else is just fodder to prove how dangerous the magic world is. We can't have other competent characters who simply oppose the methods or ideology of the protagonist. That might lead to conflict and someone who isn't the protagonist having an actual point. Remember, the protagonist isn't a walking time bomb that causes untold collateral damage with unchecked power who probably needs to be locked up to ensure public safety, but instead is just too cool to play it by the rules. And if my 3 B's don't work when designing a protagonist, then, well, that's my B. But what if the audience calls out my protagonist for being a walking disaster zone that can barely function in polite society, much less deal with the supernatural? Well, it's time to break out the angst. You see, the protagonist is secretly cursed with this really awesome supernatural ability that they must keep secret from their closest loved ones. Because if it ever gets out, then, it will be bad or something? And boy, will they let you know it, because they will never shut up about how bad they have it. They have it so bad that it excuses all of their poor behavior. I mean, I get it. I suffer from depression, and one of my symptoms is an uncontrollable urge to embezzle money. Speaking of money, does our urban fantasy protagonist have a job? Is that job hard-boiled detective? If no, then start over. A protagonist who does freelance detective work that specializes in the setting's magical side is a great way to get them into the plot, as it gives them a reason to get involved in dangerous situations. Now, an important facet of detective work is doing research, but thankfully a writer is exempt from this when writing detectives. I'm sure recycling a bunch of tropes stolen from Law & Order as well as a handful of 80s buddy cop movies will equip me with all I need to write an independent investigator. Hard-boiled detectives focus more on characters and their motives rather than the logic puzzle of the crime. These stories are often set in the underbelly of society, but in urban fantasy, this usually translates to an emphasis on characters who live on the edge between the modern and supernatural world, thus can't really turn to the traditional authorities to solve their case. Since all of my characters' motives can be boiled down to prop to make the protagonist look cool, I'm sure this will fit perfectly with my story. Just remember to not sweat the details in writing an urban fantasy detective, because it's it's not like the writer will need any of those details to stand out in a sea of urban fantasy private eyes. Besides, independent investigator sounds a lot better on your tax forms than vampire slayer or chosen one. Now, what about the supporting characters? They exist to either get in the protagonist's way, for no good reason, or to help the protagonist, for no good reason. Just visit the hard-boiled detective aisle of the Story Trope store and buy a stock cast, and it should be good. Don't forget to make everyone young, attractive, and single. No married couples allowed in urban fantasy. Got to maximize the shipping potential. See, that could have been worse. I could have a supporting cast that bridges both worlds and can be used to highlight aspects of the setting. I don't know what I would have done if those characters actually had their own motives instead of just obsessing over the protagonist. With the rest of the props, cast fleshed out, or partially if they're undead, I can now focus on the world building. Urban fantasy has a lot of the world building already done in the form of our modern world. All I have to do is add magic. Now, a little magic goes a long way, which is why I'm just gonna pour the whole mythology soup into the story. How much mythology? All of it. Greek gods, Hindu gods, Celtic myths, Norse mythology, Irish folklore, Egyptian pantheon, Native American legends, and hey, might as well weeaboo it up a bit and add some Japanese mythology as well. Don't forget to dump in the Lovecraft mythos wholesale. Also, might as well plunder Tolkien while I'm at it. He stole from the best after all. Should I, make adjustments to the myths and legends I add into my story? Of course not. Why reinvent when I can water down? No need to adjust these myths and reinterpret them to better fit with the story or to mesh them with other mythologies in interesting ways. I mean, who would want to see the Greek Titans tangle with Cthulhu? Or even worse, be one of those tryhards who just makes things up from scratch. How do all of these extremely overpowered mythical beasts go unnoticed in a modern world full of cameras and people desperate for internet pseudo-fame? Who keeps these powerful supernatural forces in check when they could easily bowl over modern civilization? Why does the race of magical elves who are immune to all modern weapons while possessing a god complex bigger than Jupiter feel the need to hide rather than just take over? Because all these questions pale in comparison to my impulsive need to add magical crap into my setting without considering its impact on said setting. Should I make a hard magic system or a soft magic system for my urban fantasy? Remember to just pick one, and then don't commit. Start with a hard magic system that has very specific rules, then just ignore those rules later. Or start with a soft magic system only to beat the audience over the head with rules unexpectedly in the middle of the story. Better to spend my time enamored with the magic part of my setting, rather than trying to mesh the magical elements with modern technology. You know, the urban part of urban fantasy. Come to think of it, maybe I should consider exactly where to set my urban fantasy. When setting an urban fantasy story in a real-world city, a writer need not worry about getting local landmarks right. What are the locals going to do, fact-check me? Man, they act like they live there or something. Besides, I actually go outside to a real urban area for research? Are you crazy? Why would I do that? I haven't left my house for over 10 years. I'm not going to start now. With my urban setting fully realized, and by fully realized, I mean I looked up a top 10 landmarks article for a real-life city and got through the first 3 entries. With that out of the way, I could turn my attention to the plot. Urban fantasy sometimes has overarching chosen one plots, but just as often tends to focus on fairly small-scale plots that keep with the whole hard-boiled noir feel of the genre. This means that a lot of urban fantasy plots tend to be either mystery plots, whodunit magic edition, monster of the week, missing person of the week, or the occasional MacGuffin plot coupon quest. All of these are perfectly serviceable plots, so long as the urban fantasy writer remembers to stick doggedly to the template and not to tweak these plots in any meaningful way, like mixing them together, have competing villainous groups clash unexpectedly, or resolve one plot only for it to bleed into another higher stakes plot. Also, avoid foreshadowing future plots in the current one. That would ruin the surprise. Better that the next monster just come out of nowhere rather than have any kind of build-up, or even worse, planting subtle clues that all of the incidents are linked. If sticking to a cookie-cutter template is too hard, then an even better alternative is to just not really have a plot. Merely string a series of action and lovemaking scenes together with the thinnest of pretexts. If a writer stumbles at any point in the makeshift string plot, then don't worry. Just have the character magic their way out of it, even if it breaks the previously established rules. What other plots could I use? How about a love triangle romance? Just kidding. What genre do you think this is? Paranormal romance with its paltry love triangles. Mere love triangles are not sufficient for urban fantasy. The protagonist's love life is of such magnitude that it can only be tracked by complicated flowcharts, and only then is a romance plot worthy of urban fantasy. It's not urban fantasy unless it's weirdly horny all the time to the point the author can't keep it in their pants for like 5 freaking minutes. Jeez. See, the difference between urban fantasy and paranormal romance is that in urban fantasy, the romance is designed to ruin the plot, whereas in paranormal romance, the romance is the plot. So I have my romance added, what else do I need? Urban fantasy often has a strong element of supernatural horror running throughout it. Since I have no idea how to write horror, I think I'll just use the next best thing. Edge. Yeah, I'll give my urban fantasy a bunch of pointlessly dark edge. Edge is pretty easy to write for urban fantasy if one remembers the 3 B's again, though in this case it stands for blood, booze, and boobs. I mean, if vampires are involved, you're probably going to at least get 2 of those. Just generously sprinkle those 3 B's into the story along with some curse words, and the whole story will be edgier than Vlad's landscaping service. Will the tone come across as juvenile? I don't know, I can't hear it. Now that I've proved my writing prowess, I think everyone will recognize that my urban fantasy setting is the perfect place to add a bunch of social commentary. And in today's cultural climate, this is definitely a safe idea that can in no way backfire if mishandled. My plot and characters may be barely functioning and paper thin, but I'm sure I've got the skill to flawlessly navigate serious real-world issues that affect actual living people in a story about witches making out with fairies. Research multiple perspectives on a hot-button issue, learning the actual culture of a marginalized people who will be represented in the story, maybe ask more than one person if this is a good allegory and not like really racist if you think about it for more than 5 seconds? Nah, full steam ahead. I would never shy away from a hot-button issue. See, here's a segment in this video's script about diversity in urban fantasy. Yeah, we're moving on. In fact, I think I'll just end the video here. Like, I'm gonna stick my hand in that dumpster fire. There is only one thing that can stop the sponsorship wars now. The Knights of Artistic Integrity will marshal its most elite forces. We must mobilize. The Adblock Force.
Good Illuminati, that is the dumbest name I've ever heard.
Adblock Force, assemble. The eternally indomitable Sir Adblock.
No ad shall get past me.
The valiantly intractable Adnihilator. Kills the shields, yeah. The ever stalwart Sir Pop-Up Crusher.
Precision, I hit the X every time.
The always reliable Sir Commercial Breaker.
I'll be back before these messages.
The most definitely not a spy from the ancient conspiracy, the most trustworthy Sir New Guy.
This video is brought to you by Campfire Blaze. And don't forget our noble and ever-vigilant leader, Knight Commander McStabby Pants.
Why do you keep calling me that?
Because it's funny. Besides, what are you going to do about it? Give us a stern warning.
Whatever, I'm not gonna rise to that. Together we are the Adblock Force. Now where's we going? Yeah, to the Megacorp Vaults. But how will we get there?
Simple. We use a force so dangerous and unpredictable that even JP himself has never mastered it. Continuity from previous episodes. The secret is Campfire Blaze, which is a browser-based writing organizational tool to help aspiring authors and dungeon masters to keep their plots straight. It has the tools needed to organize plots with timelines, to help visualize the plot's flow, as well as a host of other tools like a word processor, character sheets, character arcs, relationship details, and even tools to flesh out magic systems, languages, and artifacts that allow for an entire series Bible to be constructed. Multi-user support allows for real-time collaboration for cooperative tabletop projects, fanworks, or multi-author books. It is also the key to beating everyone else to the Megacorp Vaults.
Wait, that kinda sounds like an ad.
Oh, it totally isn't. I'm merely explaining how the sponsor works so we can use it to put a stop to the sponsorship war. See, in a previous episode, a group of rebels used it to escape into the sewers. We can use the same thing to step right into Megacorp's vaults.
Oh, good. For a second there, I thought you were reading bullet points off an ad.
Of course not. How could I be doing that when TWA fans can try the free version of Campfire Blaze or build your own subscription by choosing only the modules you need by going to bit.ly/TWA3-21. TWA fans can also use the coupon code TWA21 at checkout to receive 20% off all lifetime purchases of Blaze modules. Link is in the description below.
Wait, what was that last part?
I said the portal is ready. We merely need to step through and then all of the sponsors will be mine. To destroy once and for all, for artistic integrity, of course, and not for the culmination of all of my plotting to make sure the entire TWA expanded universe falls under my control.